I've been wanting to make a video like this for quite a while now. It's something that has been bothering me for a long time, and has always been in the back of my head. It just feels like in the last 2 years, horror games have taken a huge drop in creativity. I find myself scrolling through the Steam page, just trying to find something new and refreshing that isn't retro or mascot horror related or even co-op related. Just something new. It's been getting really hard to blatantly ignore this problem with horror games, because it feels like for every good horror game I find, I end up finding thousands of terrible ones. And yes, I understand that there will always be copycats and games that follow trends, but I don't think I've ever seen it this bad before. And I'm definitely not going to sit here and pretend that there aren't any good ones, because there have been some really amazing horror games that have come out in the past year. But that doesn't mean there's not a problem. And recently I posted on r/horrorgaming asking this very same question: why are there so many horror games that feel the same? And it was surprising to see how many people felt the same way and what they thought was the cause of this problem. So I thought, why not discuss this on YouTube and find out where this problem really starts to hopefully get closer to a solution. And before we get into it, just know that this video isn't me saying things is factual. I'd say this video is very open to discussion. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know everything, because I just don't. So if you have different opinions on the matter, I'm all ears. With that said, let's get right into it. So I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what's motivating most developers to make a horror game in the first place? Did a horror game inspire them so much that they wanted to create their own version? Are some of them just trying to find an easy way to make money? Or are they using it as steps to learn how to develop video games? Well, the answer, as usual, is a little more complicated than that, because I'd say all these reasons are why most developers decide to make a horror game. But it goes deeper than that. When it comes to horror games, there is a high tolerance for jank compared to other genres, in the same way players expect job simulator games to have some flaws. Most players expect the animations to be a little rough around the edges and the movement to feel a little bit clunky, but no, at least going in, they'll get something in return, like creepy atmosphere and of course a good scare. After all, that's what horror is about, right? So from a developer's perspective, there's a lower expectation from you that is accepted widely by the players. And the current formula for most horror games isn't very complex compared to that of a role-playing game. That, along with how easy it is to advertise with the popularity of horror games being so high on YouTube right now, it would make perfect sense to start development on a horror game whether you're a longtime developer or not. But because of these low standards accepted by most of the players, this adds to the problem. Most horror game developers won't try to do anything new or innovative because that takes more time and coding knowledge to create. And the more time and resources you put into a game, the higher the stakes are if it fails at launch. And not only that, but why put more effort into the gameplay when you can put more effort into the visuals, which usually gets more publicity. This is the first reason why I think a lot of horror games feel the same, because of the standards accepted by the players. But you can't really blame the players, because back then a good horror game was hard to come by. But it seems now the problem is flipped, where there are too many horror games that just meet those low expectations, and now it's not enough horror games striving for better. And this leads to the other problem, which is kind of a double-edged sword. Today it's easier than ever to start making a horror game, with software like Blender, Unity, the Unreal Engine, and the Unity Store. It's never been this easy to start working on a game as a new developer. And I think because of this, it's allowing a lot of these newer developers to start creating games. But don't take the time to understand the fundamentals of coding to be able to create their own game mechanics. Instead, a lot of newer developers would go in and heavily rely on bot assets and presets made by other developers. For example, did you know that there's such a thing called the Unreal Horror Engine? If you didn't know this existed, don't worry, I didn't know either. It's basically an add-on to the Unreal Engine and adds all these nice tools to make it easier and quicker to have a solid base for your horror game. But I'm sure there are a lot of developers that have gone and used this add-on without adding any code to really make their game their own. And I believe this is another reason why so many horror games feel the same. It's because of this huge jump in accessibility for people to make a game. And to really show what I'm talking about when it comes to bot assets, let's take a look at a couple of recent horror games. Starting with the oldest of the bunch, 9 Child Street, which I've covered a while back. The game has you explore this rundown house, and I want you to remember what you see in this house and just look closely at the overall layout of it as well as the furniture. And now if we look at a game called The Nightmare House, look at the interior and the building. Looks oddly familiar, right? And now if we look at a horror game called April 24th, I'll admit this has done some more changes, but it still seems oddly familiar. And that's because this house is the exact same asset being used in all 3 of these games. You can find it right now on the Unity Asset Store. It's called the Atmospheric House Modular, made by Finward Studio, running for $99. There's also another game called The Stocked, which is also pretty new, and I managed to find the asset for this mansion you run around in, which is called Horror Mansion by Art Equilibrium, running around for $44. Now, I'm not pointing this out and saying this is a bad thing. You can use bought assets in your horror game and it'd be fine so long as the game is worthwhile and was made to your own style. It saves a lot of time on the developer's part, so it's understandable that devs are going to use assets like these to speed up the process a little. The point I'm trying to make though is show you how likely you'll find horror games sharing the same assets. It's not that uncommon as you might think, and is why some things just feel oddly familiar. But even though this isn't a bad thing, it does explain why there are a lot of horror games that feel the same. And it's because they are literally using the same assets. And don't get me wrong, I know that game development is not an easy task, but it's definitely a different story if you're going to be selling your horror game rather than having it be free to play. I think it's pretty fair to assume if you're going to be paying for a horror game, it needs to be made with quality and be worth the money spent. But I feel these problems are just the beginning because it goes a lot deeper. What I'm trying to get at is we know horror games, and just games in general, are led heavily by trends. And that goes for any kind of media really. But what specifically is driving those trends? Well, when it comes to the horror genre, it's a little special because it's an emotion all of us can relate to, which is being scared. There's a certain connection you make with people when you join those emotions with them. And what I'm getting at here is the horror genre is a perfect formula for YouTube content. You can watch your favorite YouTuber play horror games and share that emotional experience with them. It's why this category is so popular. I mean, sure, you could argue trends are being led by Steam itself, which is definitely true, but I'd argue that YouTube also drives these trends. If it weren't for YouTube, would FNAF, Garden Banban, or Poppy Playtime have gotten as popular as they have? And whether you agree with me or not, it doesn't change the fact that developers are aware of how huge it is to have people play your horror games on YouTube. It's essentially free advertising, and if it gets big, you could make bank on your horror game. But what does this have to do with horror games feeling the same? Well, think of it this way, if we're making a horror game that you want to go viral on YouTube, what is essential for your horror game? Is it the gameplay, the music, or is it the visuals? I personally think it's mainly the visuals, and I think that's a huge reason why mascot horror games work so well, because it's visually separated from others. And this leads to the problem. I believe developers are focusing more on the visuals of their horror game rather than the gameplay, because at the end of the day, focusing on the visuals is what will either make or break your game in terms of success. You have a high chance of getting noticed if your visuals stand out, and if they're good enough, players won't mind the average gameplay. I believe this is one of the biggest issues with horror games today, and just gaming in general right now. It's more about what we see rather than the gameplay as long as it functions. And now knowing this, how can we solve this problem? And unfortunately, I'm not really sure. From what we talked about, I think the only way this can maybe be resolved is by starting with ourselves and not getting distracted by the eye candy of graphics. Look at the gameplay first and ask yourself if this game is really worth your time. But I know everyone has their own preferences, and I'm certainly not telling you that you can't play this or that. I think it's just good to be aware of what's going on. Acknowledging it is the very first step to solving this problem. We just need to be discussing this more and coming up with ways to fix it, because I don't think this will change anytime soon, as much as I wish it did. But if you're wanting to hear different opinions, I'll leave a link down below to the Reddit post I made. Everyone made some pretty good points, and I think it's beneficial to see everyone's take on this problem. But with that said, thanks for watching. I know this video is a little different from what I usually do, but I felt this video would hit harder if I took the, YouTube mask off for a second to address this problem. I just felt like I need to get this off my chest, and it's good to know I'm not the only one that feels this way with the state of horror games right now. I've been feeling like this for quite a while, and I just wanted to make a quick video about it. But all that said, see you next time.